She was 17 years old, and on the night her stepfather barred the door against her, she owned exactly what he could carry in two hands. His name was Cyrus Pruitt, and he was not her blood, only the man her widowed mother had married 3 winters before her death. And when Ruth Colby's mother died of a fever that spring, Cyrus Pruitt decided within the month their stepdaughter with no blood claim on his land was a mouth he no longer owed feeding. He gave her $7, the whole of what her mother had managed to hide away in a flour tin over the years, told her the world was hard and she had best learn it quick, and shut the door. With that $7, Ruth Colby bought, sight unseen, a rotting trapper's cabin deep in the timber above a mountain town called Larkspur Hollow, a place so forgotten that the county clerk had to search 2 ledgers just to find a deed, a purchase every soul who heard of it called the last foolish act of a girl who had nothing left to lose. What none of them knew, what Ruth herself did not yet know as she climbed the mountain trail with her $7 spent and her whole fortune reduced to a heap of rotted logs, was that the cabin's walls held a secret sealed away for 11 years, a secret that had been waiting, patient as stone, for someone honest enough to find it and brave enough to finish what a dead man never could. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth Colby. If you have ever been told you were worth less than the trouble of keeping you, we hope tonight's story finds you somewhere warm, and we would love to hear where you are watching from in the comments below. Ruth Colby was born in the spring of 1866 in a logging camp above the Clearwater River, the only child of a timber faller named Amos Colby and his wife, a quiet, capable woman named Sarah who had come west from Ohio with her sister's family and stayed on after falling in love with a man who could drop a 100-foot pine within a hand's breadth of where he aimed it. Ruth's earliest years were spent in the shifting, temporary world of logging camps, moved from one stand of timber to the next as her father's crew worked its way through the mountains, and though the life was hard and often lonely, it gave her something that would matter more than she could have guessed, an intimate, hands-on understanding of wood, of how it split and how it held, of the difference between timber that was sound to the heart and timber that only looked whole from the outside, while rotated hollow from within. Her father used to test a standing tree by striking it with the flat of his axe and listening to the note it gave back, a dull, dead thud meaning trouble at the core no matter how straight, until the tree appeared. And he taught Ruth to listen the same way before she was old enough to swing an axe herself, tapping fence posts and cabin logs and barrel staves with a small hammer just to hear what they were hiding. When Ruth was 9, her father was killed in a logging accident, a widowmaker branch breaking loose from above and coming down without warning, the kind of death every logger's family feared and few spoke of aloud, and her mother, left with little but a small cash settlement from the timber company and a daughter to raise, moved them down out of the high camps to the town of Larkspur Hollow, a modest mining and trapping settlement of perhaps 300 souls tucked into a mountain valley, where a vein of silver had drawn a brief rush some years before and left behind, when the vein played out, a town too stubborn or too poor to fully disperse. Sarah Colby took in mending and washing to support herself and her daughter, and it was here, in Larkspur Hollow, that Ruth came to know the man who would, without ever intending it, shape the whole of her later life, an old trapper named Elias Whitcomb, a weathered, solitary man who lived alone in a cabin high above the town, and came down perhaps once a month to trade pelts for supplies and to sit, always a little apart from the other men, at the edge of the mercantile porch. Elias Whitcomb had taken a strange, quiet liking to young Ruth Colby, perhaps because he alone among the town's children did not seem afraid of his gruffness or his scarred hands or the wild, unkempt look of a man who spent most of his life alone in high country, and perhaps because Ruth, still grieving her father, seemed to recognize in Elias something of the same solitary competence her father had carried, the same instinct for reading what the wilderness was quietly telling you if you knew how to listen. Elias began, in the years that followed, to teach Ruth small things on his visits down the mountain, how to read a game trail, how to set a snare that would not injure the animal needlessly, how to judge weather by the particular color of light on the ridgeline, and, most significantly, how to build and repair with logs and stone the way a man who intended his work to outlast him, always testing each log's soundness before he trusted it to bear weight, always building a hidden channel or a false space into anything he constructed, a habit he explained to Ruth once, half joking, as simply the caution of a man who had lived too many years in country where fellows' belongings were only as safe as his cleverness in hiding them. Ruth's mother, for her part, though she earned little, was determined that her daughter would not grow up ignorant of letters and numbers, and spent what small spare hours she had teaching Ruth to read from a handful of borrowed books and to keep sums with a stub of pencil on scraps of paper, telling her, in words Ruth would carry the whole of her life afterward, that a woman who could read a contract and count her own money was a woman no man could easily cheat, and that the world would try to cheat her regardless of how careful she was, so she had best be prepared. Sarah Colby died when Ruth was 14, worn down by years of hard work and thin winters, and it was in the aftermath of that loss that Cyrus Pruitt, a widowed rancher on the valley's far side who had known Sarah slightly and who needed, more than he needed a wife, someone to keep his house and mind his own 2 younger children, offered marriage to the grieving woman's memory in the only way available to him, by marrying Sarah's sister instead, a thin, anxious woman named Delphine who had come out from Ohio to help raise her niece and who accepted Cyrus's proposal out of a practical need for security that Ruth, even at 14, understood without anyone needing to explain it to her. It was, in its outward form, not an unkind arrangement. Delphine was not cruel to Ruth, only distant, worn thin herself by Cyrus's temper and the demands of his household, and Ruth grew accustomed over 3 years to being useful but unloved, a hand in the kitchen and the garden and the hen hays, tolerated rather than cherished, while Cyrus Pruitt's own affection went entirely to his blood children and his cattle, roughly in that order. Ruth continued, when she could slip away, to climb the mountain to visit old Elias Whitcomb, who had grown frailer over the years but who still welcomed her at his cabin door with the same gruff warmth he had shown her as a child, still teaching her, in these later visits, less about trapping now and more about the deeper history of the mountain itself, the old trails, the abandoned mine workings, and, though Ruth did not think much of it at the time, occasional strange, careful remarks about a debt he said he owed the town, a wrong he intended someday to set right before he died, though he would never say plainly what he meant. What Ruth carried out of those 17 years, before the door of the owner home she had left closed against her, was a father's ear for what stood sound and what was rotten at the core, her mother's insistence that a woman ought to be able to read and reckon for herself, and Elias Whitcomb's quiet, patient habit of building hidden things into honest work, 3 separate inheritances that seemed, on the night Cyrus Pruitt turned her out, like nothing at all against the vast indifference of the world, and that would prove, before another year had passed, to be the only tool she needed. The fall, when it came, was sudden in its final form, though it had been building for months beneath the surface. Delphine Pruitt, Ruth's aunt by marriage, had grown steadily more ill through that final winter with a wasting sickness the town's one doctor could neither name nor cure, and in the weeks before her death she had begun, in her fading clarity, to speak more openly to Ruth than she ever had before, telling her, among other things, that she was sorry, that she had watched Cyrus grow colder toward his stepdaughter over the years, and had lacked the strength or the standing in her own household to prevent it, and that Ruth ought to know she had a small sum of money, $7, that Delphine had managed quietly to set aside from her own household allowance over the years specifically for Ruth, hidden in a flour tin at the back of the pantry, in case the day ever came when she needed to leave quickly. Delphine died in March, and Cyrus Pruitt, freed of the last thread of obligation that had bound him even loosely to his stepdaughter, waited scarcely a month before telling Ruth, in the flat, unapologetic tone of a man settling accounts, that she was 17 now, old enough to earn her own keep elsewhere, and that his household had children of his own blood to provide for and no more room for a girl who was, in the end, no relation to him at all. He gave her, with what he seemed to consider generosity, a single night to gather her things, and the next morning Ruth Colby found the flour tin exactly where Delphine had promised, $7 in worn coin and small bills, and understood, holding it, that her aunt's last quiet act of love had handed her the entire sum of her future. She did not go immediately to Larkspur Hollow, but first climbed, one final time, the mountain trail to Elias Whitcomb's cabin, needing, in her grief and fear, the comfort of the one person left in the world who had never once made her feel like a burden, only to find, on arriving, that the cabin stood silent and cold, its door slightly ajar, and that old Elias, who she now learned from a neighboring trapper had died peacefully in his sleep some 3 weeks before, unnoticed for several days in his isolation, had already been buried in the small Larkspur Hollow cemetery by townsfolk who barely knew him well enough to say more over his grave than a few respectful words. Ruth stood alone in the empty cabin for a long while that afternoon, grieving a second loss so close upon the first, and it was there, Standing amid Elias Whitcomb's abandoned belongings that she learned from the same neighboring trapper, an old man named Silas Crone who had known Elias for decades, that the cabin in its quarter section of mountain land had gone, upon Elias's death, to auction for unpaid taxes, since Elias had left no will and no kin that anyone in Larkspur Hollow could name. The auction, Silas told her, almost as an afterthought, was to be held that very Saturday at the county land office in the town below, and no one expected much interest, since the cabin was little more than a rotting trapper's shack on a stony, unproductive quarter section no rancher wanted and no miner believed held any further ore. Ruth walked down the mountain that evening with $7 in her coat pocket and a decision already forming in her chest that she could not entirely explain even to herself, some mixture of grief and stubbornness and conviction, half-formed but fierce, that she could not simply let a stranger by and likely tear down the one place in the world that had ever felt like sanctuary to her. The auction, when Saturday came, was as sparsely attended as Silas had predicted, a handful of men there mainly for a more promising parcel of grazing land being sold the same afternoon, and when the county auctioneer, a brisk, uninterested man named Whitlock, called the Whitcomb cabin in its quarter section, the opening bid drew nothing but silence and a few muffled laughs from men who saw no earthly use in rotting logs on worthless stone. Ruth, standing at the back in her plain travel coat with $7 sewn carefully into an inner pocket, spoke up before her nerve could fail her, offering the full sum, and Whitlock, eager to be rid of an unwanted lot and mildly startled that anyone had bid at all, brought his gavel down before the moment could pass. $7 for the Whitcomb cabin and 40 stony acres above Larkspur Hollow, and Ruth Colby, cast out of one home not 2 days before, found herself the owner of another, though every man in that auction yard, and every soul in town who heard of it by supper, agreed the girl had thrown away the last of her money on a shack not worth the nails holding it together. She climbed the mountain that same evening and slept that first night in Elias Whitcomb's own narrow bed, wrapped in a moth-eaten trapper's blanket that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine, and in the gray light of morning she began, the way grief sometimes turns itself usefully into labor, to set the cabin to rights, sweeping out years of dust and mouse leavings, mending a section of roof shingle by shingle, and it was in doing this work, running her hands over every log to weigh her. Father had once taught her to test a standing tree, tapping each timber with a small hammer Elias himself had given her years before as a child, that she came upon a section of the rear wall, behind where Elias's narrow bed had stood, that gave back not the dull, honest thud of solid wood, but a distinctly hollow note, the same telltale emptiness her father had taught her to listen for in a rotten pine. Her heart beginning to pound, Ruth examined the logs more closely by daylight and saw what she had missed the night before in exhaustion and grief, that this section of wall had been built differently from the rest, the logs slightly shorter, fitted into a rough wooden frame rather than notched directly into the corner post the way Elias had built everything else in that cabin with a trapper's practical solidity, and remembering, with a chill, Elias's old, half-joking habit of building hidden channels into his work, and his strange final remarks about a debt he owed the town, Ruth found the edge of the false section with her fingers and, working a whittled wedge into the seam the way Elias himself had once shown her to work a stuck door, pried the panel loose to reveal a narrow cavity built into the wall's thickness, containing a canvas-wrapped bundle that had clearly rested undisturbed for a great many years. Inside the canvas, when Ruth's shaking hands finally worked it open in the thin morning light, she found a leather satchel containing a thick sheaf of papers, several worn newspaper clippings gone brittle and yellow, and, wrapped separately in oilcloth at the very bottom, a small, heavy pouch that gave a dull metallic weight when she lifted it, though she did not yet dare open it, setting it aside instead to first understand, with mounting unease, what the papers had to tell her. The newspaper clippings, dated some 11 years earlier, told of a robbery at the Larkspur Hollow Mining and Trust Company, a modest institution that had briefly served the town during its silver rush years, in which a payroll shipment of just over $3,000, money meant for the wages of some 60 miners and their families, had vanished in a robbery blamed at the time on a trapper and occasional prospector named Elias Whitcomb, who had been seen in town the day before the robbery, and who fled into the high country immediately afterward rather than answer the sheriff's questions, a flight the newspapers of the time took as the clearest possible confession of guilt. A posse had pursued him for a week without success, and though he was never caught, never tried, and never in 11 years seen to spend a single dollar beyond what a trapper honestly earned from his pelts, the name Elias Whitcomb had become, in Larkspur Hollow's memory, a byword for betrayal, The man who had stolen the wages of 60 families and vanished into the mountains to live out his days on their stolen fortune. A reputation Ruth now understood, holding the evidence of his innocence in her trembling hands, that Elias had carried silently and without complaint for 11 years, never once, in all his gentle kindness to a grieving orphan girl, defending himself or asking for anything in return. The remaining papers in the satchel, a set of careful, cramped handwritten pages that Ruth recognized with a jolt as Elias's own hand, told the rest. A private accounting the old trapper had apparently written for himself sometime in his final years, perhaps sensing his own death approaching and wanting the truth recorded somewhere even if he lacked the courage or the standing to speak it aloud in his lifetime. Elias wrote that on the night of the robbery, he had indeed been in town, and had indeed seen the true thief, a younger clerk at the mining and trust named Bartholomew Reese, who worked directly under the bank's owner, and who Elias had glimpsed slipping out a rear door of the trust company well after closing hours with a satchel far too heavy for an honest errand. Elias, by his own account, had confronted Reese the following morning before the theft was even publicly known, and Reese, cornered, had not denied the crime but had instead threatened Elias directly, telling him that he, Reese, was a nephew and sole trusted heir of the trust company's aging owner, a man named Horace Dunmore, who by then was half-blind and easily led, and that if Elias breathed a word of what he had seen, Reese would ensure that every soul in Larkspur Hollow believed the friendless old trapper, and not the respectable young clerk, had committed the theft, a threat made entirely credible by the fact that Reese, by his uncle's authority, controlled the very records that might have proven or disproven either man's account. Elias, by his own written admission, had panicked, certain no jury in that mining town would ever believe a solitary trapper over a banker's trusted nephew, and had fled into the high country rather than face an accusation he was certain he could not defeat, a decision that had, in the eyes of the whole valley, condemned him. What Elias did next, according to his own pages, was in some ways stranger than the flight itself. Some weeks later, working a trapline in a remote canyon, he had come upon Reese himself alone, apparently cashing a portion of the stolen payroll in a hollow tree, unaware he was observed, and Elias, rather than confront him a second time, had simply waited until Reese departed and had taken the cash money himself, some $800 in gold coin, not to keep, his pages insisted with, an old man's careful, guilty precision, but to hold safe until he could find some way to see it returned to the families it belonged to without bringing ruin upon himself in the telling. He had, it seemed, never found that way, or never found the courage for it, and had instead grown old alone on the mountain with a stolen town's judgment hanging over his name and $800 of its stolen payroll hidden in his cabin wall, a burden Ruth now understood he had carried in silent penance for 11 long years. The debt to the town he had spoken of so obliquely in his final visits with her, made suddenly terribly clear. Ruth sat with those pages long into that first morning, weeping for the old man's private torment as much as for what the truth now demanded of her, understanding that she held in her hands not merely $800, which alone would have transformed her circumstances entirely, but the power to clear a dead man's name and to return, however incompletely, a portion of what 60 families had lost 11 years before, and understanding also, with a cold clarity, that Bartholomew Reese, if he still lived and still held his position at the mining and trust, would not welcome the resurrection of a scandal he had spent over a decade quietly burying beneath another man's ruined name. She learned within the week, through careful, quiet questions in Larkspur Hollow, that she was careful never to frame as more than an orphan girl's idle curiosity, that Bartholomew Reese was very much alive and very much prospering, having inherited full control of the mining and trust company outright some 4 years earlier upon his uncle Horace Dunmore's death, and having since built himself into the single most powerful man in the valley, holding mortgages on nearly a third of the surrounding ranches and farms, sitting on the town council, and enjoying, by virtue of both wealth and passage of time, a reputation as an upstanding pillar of Larkspur Hollow that no one, Ruth quickly understood, would readily believe could be built atop an old theft and an innocent man's ruined name. Ruth also learned, from the same careful questioning, the names of several families still living in Larkspur Hollow who had lost wages in that long-ago robbery, among them a retired miner named Obadiah Finch, now aged and struggling, who had lost nearly 2 months' pay he had been saving toward his daughter's wedding, and a woman named Constance Ojeda, widow of another miner, who had raised 3 children alone on wages that theft had cut short to the worst possible season, and it was in, speaking carefully, gently, with Constance Ojeda first, showing her nothing yet but asking gentle questions about the old robbery and what she remembered of it, that Ruth began to understand just how deeply the theft shadows still lay across the town. Families still nursing old grievances, still believing without question the official story of a guilty trapper who had vanished with their money and left them to struggle on without it. What Ruth needed, she came slowly to understand, working through the problem with the same patient care her mother had once applied to a stubborn column of sums, was proof strong enough to stand on its own, since Elias Whitcomb's own confession, however sincere, was the private writing of a dead man who could no longer be questioned, and would not alone be believed against a wealthy, respected banker, especially not when carried forward by a penniless orphan girl he could dismiss in a moment as either mad or scheming. She needed something Reese himself could not simply deny, and turning the problem over across several sleepless nights, she realized that the answer might lie in the very record the mining and trust company itself was required by county law to keep, records of that old robbery's original investigation, the amount reported missing, the payroll manifest naming every family owed wages that season, records that, if they still existed in the county archive rather than solely in Reese's own private ledgers, might corroborate details Elias's confession described that no outsider could plausibly have invented. She traveled, on a pretext of seeking clerking work, to the county seat some 2 days' ride distant, and there, in the dusty back room of the county recorder's office, found precisely what she had hoped for, the original 1875 investigation file, filed and forgotten by clerks with no particular stake in an old, closed case, containing the sheriff's original report describing the robbery, the exact sum taken, and, crucially, a brief notation, easily overlooked by anyone not specifically searching for it, that the initial teller who discovered the theft the following morning had reported the vault's outer lock undamaged, suggesting at the time that whoever committed the robbery had used a key rather than force, a detail that had never made its way into the newspaper accounts that convicted Elias Whitcomb in the court of public opinion, since Elias, a trapper with no bank position, could never have possessed such a key, while Bartholomew Reese, then a trusted clerk with access to the vault, certainly had. Armed with this, and with Elias's own written confession, and with her growing understanding of exactly which families in Larkspur Hollow had been wronged and how deeply, Ruth returned to the mountain town with a plan taking clearer shape in her mind, understanding that she would need, as her mother had always taught her, to approach this not as a wounded girl seeking vindication for a man she had loved, but as someone prepared to lay out facts a reasonable person could not simply wave away. The conflict came, as such things often do, the moment Ruth's careful questioning reached ears she had not intended it to reach. Constance Ojeda, moved and troubled by Ruth's gentle inquiries about the old robbery, mentioned them in passing to a cousin who did occasional bookkeeping for the mining and trust, and within days word had reached Bartholomew Reese himself. The girl was up at the old Whitcomb cabin asking pointed questions about a theft 11 years buried. Reese, a smooth, silver-templed man in his middle 40s who had spent a decade perfecting the appearance of unimpeachable respectability, rode up the mountain himself within the week, ostensibly to welcome the cabin's new young owner to the valley and to inquire, with practiced warmth, whether she might be interested in selling the property to the mining and trust outright, which he explained, quite reasonably on its surface, wished to consolidate its holdings on that side of the mountain for future timber rights. Ruth, understanding immediately that this was no ordinary neighborly courtesy but a man attempting to reclaim and destroy evidence before it could reclaim him, declined politely, and watched, as Naomi Bellwether once had in a different valley entirely, something cold flicker behind a pleasant smile before Reese tipped his hat and rode back down the mountain. The pressure that followed was subtle at first, and then increasingly less so. The Larkspur Hollow Mercantile, in which Reese held a controlling financial interest, began refusing Ruth credit on supplies she needed to properly winterize the cabin. A local rancher who had agreed to trade labor for a share of Ruth's timber found the arrangement mysteriously fall through. Whispers began moving through town, carefully seeded and never traceable directly to Reese himself, that the Whitcomb girl, as people had taken to calling her, was stirring up old grief for reasons no decent person could quite account for, perhaps simple attention-seeking, perhaps something worse. Ruth felt Larkspur Hollow's sympathy, thin to begin with for an outsider with no family standing, curdling into suspicion exactly as she suspected it once had against Elias himself, and she understood she could not simply confront Reese directly with an old man's confession and a sheriff-forgotten notation, not when he controlled the mercantile, held mortgages on a third of the valley's farms, and counted among his social circle both the town's justice of the peace and its only newspaper editor. What Ruth needed, working the problem through as patiently as her father had once tested a standing tree for rot at its core, was not a private confrontation Reese could simply deny in a closed room, but a public reckoning before witnesses he could not intimidate one by one, and she needed, above all, the wrong families themselves standing together rather than approach separately where Reese's influence could pick them off. She spent the better part of a month, working to keep the cabin sound by day and visiting families by lantern-lit evening, showing each of them in turn the payroll manifest careful listing of their own lost wages alongside Elias's written confession, watching old grief give way to a slow, hardening resolve. And she also, cautious of Reese's reach into the local justice system, wrote a careful letter to a circuit judge he had learned rode through the county twice yearly, a deliberate man, named Judge Reuben Olcott, known even among Reese's own circles incorruptible, requesting a hearing at his next sitting, still weeks distant, and trusting that a stranger's careful letter, backed by documentation from the county's own archive, would earn at least the courtesy of an audience. Reese, sensing the tide beginning to shift beneath him as families he had once assumed permanently cowed began quietly comparing notes, made one final, desperate maneuver in the weeks before the judge's sitting, filing a claim through a friendly county clerk asserting that the original Whitcomb land purchased 11 years before had never been properly recorded due to an irregularity in the old mining claim boundaries. An obvious pretext meant to strip Ruth of her standing and, not incidentally, of the physical cabin where the remaining evidence, including the $800 in gold Ruth had not yet dared to spend or reveal, still sat hidden. It was a county sheriff's own deputy, a young man named Tobias Reyes who had grown quietly troubled by what he had begun to overhear of Reese's maneuvering, who rode up the mountain the night before the claim was to take effect and warned Ruth, in a low and uneasy voice, that if she had anything worth protecting, she had best move it before morning. Ruth did not sleep at all that night, working by lantern light with Constance Ojeda, who had by then become her staunchest ally in the valley, to gather the satchel of papers and the pouch of gold coin, and Ruth carried them herself, on horseback borrowed from Constance, the 2 days' ride to the county seat, arriving travel-worn and anxious to find, to her enormous relief, that Judge Olcott's sitting had in fact been moved forward by several days at the quiet urging of Deputy Reyes himself, who had grown as weary of Reese's shadow over the valley as anyone. By the time Reese's claim reached the county recorder's desk, there was nothing left of the cabin to seize, and word had already reached the county seat that the circuit judge intended to hear a very different matter that same week. The hearing, when it came, unfolded with a slow, methodical wait that left little room for Reese's practiced charm to find purchase. Judge Olcott examined the original 1875 investigation file, the sheriff's notation regarding the undamaged vault lock, Elias Whitcomb's own written confession, and heard testimony, one after another, from Obadiah Finch, from Constance Ojeda, and from half a dozen other families whose names fill the old payroll manifest, each describing wages lost 11 years before and a friendless trapper's name forever blackened for a crime committed by another man entirely. Reese attempted, at first, to dismiss the entire matter as a fevered invention of a grieving girl clinging to an old man's memory, but Judge Olcott, cross-referencing the county archive's own vault lock notation against banking records Reese was legally required to produce, found that the only key to that vault in 1875 besides the owner's own had been issued, by the bank's own internal records, to its trusted clerk, one Bartholomew Reese, a detail Reese himself, in over a decade of quiet security, had apparently never thought anyone would think to unearth from documents so thoroughly forgotten. Judge Olcott did not need a great deal more. Reese was bound over for trial on charges of theft and fraud, and though the finer mechanisms of frontier justice moved imperfectly and slowly, as they so often did in that country and time, Reese lost, within the year, his controlling interest in the mining and trust, forced by the court's judgment to surrender both the interest that had accrued and a substantial portion of his personal holdings toward restitution for the family's old theft, and his subsequent decade of quiet consolidation, had wronged Elias Whitcomb's name. Meanwhile, was formally and publicly cleared by the same court, his old reputation as a thief struck from a county-s and replaced, at Judge Olcott's own insistence, with a brief but dignified notation of his wrongful accusation, a small mercy that could not restore 11 lonely years to a dead man but that mattered enormously, Ruth found, to her own grieving heart. The $800 in gold coin, Ruth insisted from the very first day it was safely delivered into the court's keeping, belonged to no one but the families the old robbery had wronged, and she distributed her share of it. Once Judge Alcott ruled a small portion legally Hayes as the property's rightful owner and the one who had uncovered and risked everything to surface the truth, almost entirely back into the town itself, using what she kept not for herself alone but to properly rebuild the Whitcomb cabin into a sound, weathertight home, and to establish, with the remainder and the quiet blessing of family she had helped make whole again, a small trading post at the mountain's base where trappers and prospectors of modest means, people the valley's grander institutions had always overlooked, could buy honest supplies at a fair price and be trusted, the way Elias himself had once quietly trusted his neighbors, without suspicion or condescension. We began this story by telling you that a 17-year-old girl, cast out with nothing, spent her last $7 on a rotting trapper's cabin nobody wanted, and that hidden within its walls lay an outlaw's secret that would change everything forever. Now you understand what that secret truly was. Not the guilt of a friendless old man, as the whole valley had believed for 11 long years, but his quiet, unspoken innocence, and a debt of conscience he carried alone rather than risk the world's judgment a second time. Ruth Colby never forgot what her father once taught her about listening for the hollow note hidden beneath a solid-looking surface, nor what her mother taught her about a woman's right to read the truth for herself rather than accept what she was told, nor the quiet, careful kindness of an old trapper who built hidden safety into everything he touched because the world had given him little reason to trust it openly. She had been told, by the only family she had left, that she was worth no more than the trouble of feeding her, and yet she had found, in a stranger's abandoned cabin, proof that worth is rarely where the world expects to find it, and that patience, honestly kept, can uncover truth even 11 years of silence cannot fully bury. Thank you for spending this hour with Ruth Colby and the people of Larkspur Hollow. If her story moved you, we hope you will share it with someone who needs reminding that being cast aside by one person does not mean the world has no place for you, and that what looks like a foolish, worthless purchase to everyone else may in fact be exactly where your future has been quietly waiting. We would love to know, in the comment below, about a time you found real value in something the world had already written off, whether it was an old home, a forgotten skill, or simply a chance you almost let pass you by. Your stories mean a great deal to this community, and we read every single one of them. If tonight's journey to Larkspur Hollow stayed with you, we have many more stories like Ruth's waiting for you. Until next time, stay close.